We've got a pretty dense chapter here on the legal and ethical issues surrounding mental health services, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking this with you.
Yeah, it's an area where psychology and the law intersect, and that can lead to some pretty tricky situations.
Well, the chapter starts with this case about Arthur, a man dealing with some pretty intense psychological issues, and honestly, it threw me for a loop.
Oh, yeah.
He's got this secret plan, talks about breaking into the German embassy, and his family's understandably freaked out.
Right. Arthur's case is a really good example of just how complicated involuntary commitment can be. I mean, it raises the question, when does someone's behavior cross the line from being a little eccentric to actually needing intervention?
And you'd think if the family's that worried, there'd be like a clear-cut path to get someone help, but the chapter makes it clear that it's not that simple.
No, not at all. We have to think about the individual's right to autonomy while also protecting them and the public from potential harm. And legally, there are very specific criteria for involuntary commitment. Just having unusual beliefs or making your family uncomfortable doesn't automatically meet those criteria.
So what does meet the criteria? The chapter mentions some big legal cases that kind of shape this whole area.
Yeah, cases like O'Connor v. Donaldson and Addington v. Texas were really important in establishing this idea of dangerousness as like a key factor for involuntary commitment.
Okay.
The courts basically said you can't just commit someone because they're mentally ill. There has to be actual evidence that they pose a real threat to themselves or to others.
That makes sense. But then the chapter brought up Joyce Brown's case, and it seemed like dangerousness wasn't the only thing they looked at there.
Right. Joyce Brown's case introduced this idea of grave disability as another possible reason for commitment.
Right.
She was homeless and clearly having a hard time taking care of herself, but she wasn't necessarily dangerous in like a violent way. And this really sparked a debate about whether someone's inability to function on their own, even if they're not an immediate threat, should be enough to justify intervention.
It's a tough question. Like, on the one hand, you don't want to infringe on someone's freedom, but on the other, you want to help someone who's obviously suffering. Where do you even draw the line?
Yeah, it's a very delicate balance. It highlights this tension that often exists between individual rights and the responsibility we have to each other as a society. And the precedents set by these cases are still being debated and refined today, and they have a huge impact on how mental health services are provided and accessed.
Yeah, it feels like we're just scratching the surface of how complicated this all is.
Yeah,
And then the chapter dives into the insanity defense, which always seems to be such a controversial topic.
it is, and the media often portrays it in a very sensationalized way.
Yeah.
The chapter really emphasizes how different the public perception of the insanity defense is from the reality.
So it's not just a get-out-of-jail-free card like you see in the movies.
No, not at all. The chapter points out that the insanity defense is used in less than 1% of felony cases, and it's successful even less often than that.
Oh.
And even if someone is found not guilty by reason of insanity, they're usually committed to a psychiatric facility for treatment and potentially for a very long time.
That is so different from what you usually see on TV.
Right.
I guess what I don't get is how you even define insanity in a legal sense. It
Yeah.
seems so subjective.
It is a really important question, and the legal definition has changed over time. The chapter breaks down a few different criteria that have been used. One of the oldest is the Imnighten rule, which focuses on whether the person understood that what they were doing was wrong at the time of the crime.
So if someone was so mentally impaired that they didn't even realize they were doing something wrong, that could be a basis for the insanity defense.
Yeah, but there are other criteria too. The Durham rule expanded the definition to include the presence of a mental disease or defect as a factor. And the American Law Institute criteria looks at both cognitive and volitional factors, meaning, did they understand their actions and could they control them?
So it's not just about knowing right from wrong. It's also about being able to control your behavior, even if you do know the difference.
Exactly. And then you have the alternative verdict of guilty but mentally ill, or GBMI, which tries to acknowledge both the crime and the mental illness.
I've heard that term before, but never really understood what it meant.
Yeah.
Does it change how someone is treated in the legal system?
Well, in theory, it should. With a GBMI verdict, the person still gets a prison sentence, but the idea is that they'll also receive mental health treatment while they're incarcerated. It's an attempt to address both the need for punishment and the need for rehabilitation.
That seems like a really tricky balance to strike.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if prisons are even equipped to provide adequate mental health care.
That's a whole other issue, and it really highlights the complexities of how mental illness is understood and dealt with within the legal system.
All this talk about legal definitions and criteria makes me wonder, What about the idea of competence to stand trial? I remember that being mentioned in the chapter.
Oh, yeah. Competence is absolutely essential for a fair trial. It basically comes down to whether a person can understand the legal proceedings and work effectively with their lawyer to defend themselves. If someone is found incompetent to stand trial, they can be committed to a mental health facility until they're deemed competent.
Okay, that makes sense. But couldn't that lead to someone being held indefinitely if they never become competent?
That's a valid concern, but there are safeguards in place to prevent that. The courts have said that someone can only be held for a reasonable amount of time to regain competence. After that, they have to either be found competent released or committed under civil law, kind of like we discussed earlier with involuntary commitment.
So there are legal checks and balances to make sure the system isn't being abused.
Right. But even with those safeguards, assessing competence can be really challenging. It often relies heavily on the expertise of mental health professionals, which brings us to another key topic from the chapter: the role of expert witnesses.
All right, this is where things go from the textbook to the courtroom. I've always been curious about what it's like for mental health professionals to actually testify in legal cases.
It's a very unique and often very demanding role. They might be asked to evaluate someone's mental state at the time of a crime, give their opinion on the risk of future dangerousness, or offer insights into a defendant's ability to understand legal proceedings. Their expertise can really have a significant impact on how a case turns out.
And the chapter mentioned predicting dangerousness, and that sounds incredibly difficult, if not impossible. How do experts even approach that?
It's a major challenge, and research actually shows that long-term predictions of violence are notoriously unreliable. There are assessment tools and risk factors that experts consider, but there's always going to be some uncertainty involved.
So it's not an exact science.
No, not at all. And the chapter emphasizes that we need more research to make these assessments more accurate. It's a reminder that even expert testimony has its limitations.
It makes you think about how much weight should be given to that kind of testimony if it's not always accurate.
That's a good point. And it highlights the importance of thinking critically and carefully, considering all the evidence in cases that involve mental illness. The legal system depends on mental health expertise, but it's crucial to remember that it's not perfect and there are inherent uncertainties.
Okay, so we've covered involuntary commitment, the insanity defense competence to stand trial, and the role of expert witnesses. Is there anything else packed into this chapter?
There is, and it might be the most important part of all: evidence-based practice and the use of clinical practice guidelines.
Oh yeah, that's about making sure that mental health treatment is actually based on research and proven to work right.
Exactly. And it's becoming more and more important as healthcare focuses more on outcomes and cost effectiveness.
So are you saying there are like specific guidelines that mental health professionals should be following?
Yes, and they're becoming much more common. Clinical practice guidelines are essentially recommendations for how to treat specific mental health disorders based on the latest scientific research.
So instead of every clinician just doing their own thing, there's this evidence-based roadmap to help them make decisions.
That's the goal. It's about moving away from just relying on personal experience and opinions and toward a more data-driven approach. Of course, guidelines aren't meant to be rigid. They still need to be tailored to each patient's individual needs and situation.
That makes sense. It's about using the best available evidence to guide treatment, but still allowing for some flexibility and personalized care. What stands out to you most from all this information?
For me, it's how interconnected everything is. The legal and ethical frameworks shape how research is conducted, which then informs clinical practice guidelines, which ultimately impact the care that patients receive. It's this whole complex ecosystem with potentially life-changing consequences.
It's like a domino effect, but with real people's lives on the line. The weight of that responsibility is really hitting me.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic for sure. But I think this deep dive has given us a much deeper understanding of the forces that are shaping mental health services and how they all interact.
I completely agree. I feel like I have a whole new way of looking at this issue, and it makes me appreciate the challenges faced by both the mental health professionals and the people they're trying to help.
Well said. And speaking of challenges, are you ready to tackle how the law addresses specific mental health conditions?
Let's do it. This chapter has been full of surprises so far, so I'm sure there's a lot more to uncover.
You know, before we move on, it's important to remember that the legal definition of mental illness isn't always the same as what you'd find in the DSM-5, like what mental health professionals use.
Oh, so what we might consider a mental illness clinically isn't necessarily how the law sees it.
Exactly. It's ultimately up to the courts, not clinicians, to decide if someone meets that legal definition of mental illness, and that can have a big impact on legal proceedings.
That's a really interesting distinction. It's like two separate languages, legal versus clinical.
Yep.
And speaking of legal stuff, what about diminished capacity?
Yeah.
The chapter touched on that, but I didn't quite get how it works.
Okay, so diminished capacity basically argues that someone's mental state can affect their ability to form criminal intent. It's
Wow.
not the same as the insanity defense, but it's a related concept.
So it's not saying they didn't do it, but that their mental illness played a part in their actions.
Exactly. It recognizes that mental illness can influence judgment, impulse control, decision making, and that could potentially reduce someone's responsibility for their actions.
This deep dive is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about the legal system.
Yeah.
It's so much more nuanced than I ever realized.
It really is. It's all about challenging our assumptions and recognizing that human behavior is complicated, especially when mental illness is involved. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of this chapter: research ethics.
Research ethics.
Hmm?
I'm guessing this is about making sure that people who participate in research are protected and their well-being is taken care of.
Exactly. The chapter emphasizes the importance of informed consent, meaning participants need to fully understand the risks and benefits of a study before they agree to be part of it. And this is especially important when you're studying mental illness because people might be more vulnerable due to their condition.
Yeah, that seems pretty obvious.
Mhm.
Why would anyone do research without getting informed consent?
Well, you'd be surprised. Unfortunately, there have been times when research ethics were violated, especially with vulnerable populations. Like, think about the Tuskegee syphilis study, for example. It's a stark reminder of why we need ethical guidelines and oversight boards to prevent these kinds of things from happening.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that even when people have good intentions, research can go wrong without the right safeguards in place.
Yeah.
Speaking of good intentions, I want to go back to those clinical practice guidelines for a second. We talked about them earlier, but I'm still trying to grasp how they bridge the gap between research and what actually happens in practice.
It's all about taking those scientific findings and turning them into concrete recommendations that clinicians can actually use. The chapter points out that clinical practice guidelines can help make sure everyone's on the same page, reduce inconsistencies in treatment approaches, and ultimately lead to better outcomes for patients.
So instead of every therapist or psychiatrist doing their own thing, they have this evidence-based guide to help them make decisions.
Right. The idea is to move away from relying on anecdotes and personal preferences and toward a more data-driven approach. Of course, guidelines aren't meant to be rigid rules. They need to be adjusted based on the individual patient and their specific circumstances.
That makes sense. It's like using the best available evidence to make treatment decisions, but still being flexible and providing personalized care. What's the biggest takeaway for you from all of this?
I think for me, it's how interconnected everything is. The legal and ethical frameworks influence how research is conducted, which then leads to the creation of clinical practice guidelines, and those guidelines ultimately have an impact on the care that people receive. It's a whole complex system with the potential to really change people's lives.
It's like a chain reaction, but with real people's lives hanging in the balance? That's a pretty heavy responsibility.
It is a serious topic.
Yeah.
But I think this deep dive has given us a much better understanding of all the factors that influence mental health services and how they all work together.
I totally agree. I feel like I have a completely new perspective on this issue.
Yeah.
And it makes me appreciate the challenges faced by both mental health professionals and the people they work with.
I think you put it perfectly. And speaking of challenges, are you ready to dive into how the law handles specific mental health conditions?
I'm ready. Let's
Sure.
do it. This chapter has been full of surprises so far. I'm sure there's even more to discover. Okay, so let's get into these specific mental health conditions and how the law tries to deal with them. What's up first?
Well, the chapter goes into a few different areas, starting with substance use disorders.
Right, that's a huge issue. Substance abuse affects so many people, and I bet the legal system is always trying to figure out the best way to respond.
Yeah, it's a really complex problem, and the chapter talks about how the legal approaches have changed over time. We've kind of shifted from seeing substance use mainly as a criminal justice problem to more of a public health perspective.
So instead of just throwing people in jail, there's more focus on treatment and rehab.
Exactly. There's this growing understanding that addiction is a disease, not just a moral failing, and that treatment can be much more effective than punishment when it comes to addressing the underlying causes.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are still legal consequences for substance-related offenses, even if the approach is changing.
Oh, of course. There are still laws against things like driving under the influence, possession of illegal substances, and all that. But there's also a push for alternatives like drug courts and diversion programs that try to get people into treatment instead of just locking them up.
It seems like finding that balance between holding people accountable and showing compassion is a theme that keeps coming up in mental health law.
It does. And it's especially important when we're talking about how the law deals with mental illness in the context of family law.
Family law. I hadn't even considered that. How does mental illness factor into that?
Well, think about things like custody battles, divorce proceedings, or even elder care. Mental health issues can have a huge impact on these legal situations.
So if someone is struggling with a serious mental illness, that could actually affect their parental rights or their ability to make choices about their own care.
It's a really delicate and complex area, and the courts have to juggle a lot of different factors. They have to consider the individual's rights, the best interests of any children that might be involved, and the potential risks and benefits of different legal decisions.
It sounds like there's a lot of room for personal opinions and interpretations in these cases.
Yeah, there is. And that's where mental health professionals can play such a vital role. They can provide assessments, expert testimony, and really help the courts make informed choices that protect both individual rights and the well-being of everyone involved.
This is some heavy stuff. I feel like every area we dig into just brings up more questions and ethical dilemmas.
It really does. And that's why this intersection of mental health and the law is so fascinating. It forces us to confront some of the most fundamental questions about individual freedom, our responsibility to society, and the role of the legal system in helping those who need it.
You know, it also makes me think about how all of this might change as technology advances.
Hmm?
You mentioned earlier how neuroscience and things like that could revolutionize mental health care. How do you think that will impact the legal side of things?
It's a really interesting question. Just imagine a future where we have brain imaging that can provide more concrete proof of mental illness that could definitely change how the law defines and handles things like the insanity defense.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. What if we can use personalized medicine to develop super targeted treatments that are way more effective than what we have now? Could that change how we approach things like addiction or even criminal behavior?
I think it's definitely possible. And then there's AI. Could we have algorithms that help with diagnosis risk assessment or even legal decision making? The possibilities are exciting, but also kind of scary.
It feels like we're standing at the edge of a whole new era in mental health care, and the law is going to have to catch up and adapt to all these advancements.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be having these discussions right now. We need to really think about the ethical, legal, and social implications of these new technologies and make sure we're using them in a responsible and compassionate way.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's made me realize just how complicated and constantly evolving the world of mental health law really is. It's a field that requires continuous learning, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge what you think you know.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I hope this conversation has given you the knowledge and insights you need to navigate this complex landscape and maybe even become an advocate for positive change.
Absolutely. To everyone listening out there, keep those questions coming, keep digging deeper, and thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.